What's the scariest thing you've ever witnessed? When I was 13, my dad popping out like 30 sleeping pills in front of me, and swallowing all of them, in an attempt to kill himself. My mom refusing to call an ambulance, and I had to do it. The fire department arriving, and keeping my dad awake, as he swayed around and fell over, and vomited in the yard. Then they took him to the hospital, and my drunk mom decided, we should all get in the car and follow him, and then we crashed the car, and almost died. I almost lost my whole family in one night. Honestly, haven't thought about that night, since I was a teenager still. Are you okay now? Honestly man, no I'm not. I have an okay job, but life seems pretty bleak. And I'm on my own, just me, and my beloved dog at 30 years old. I'm trying my best to reconnect with friends and see my family enough. But my whole existence feels like, make the most of it, because things only get worse. Always and only worse. I love and appreciate my life, but always in a depressing and depressed point of view. Sorry if I overshared, but you asked. This whole thread has got me emotional. And I'm sure, a lot of people these days feel like I do. I used to work on offshore oil rigs. The generators that power them are the size of a small house. One day, a technician forgot to lock out, tag out, while he was checking why we were having voltage drops on the pump floor. A supervisor came by, and saw the third generator was off, and decided to fire it up. I was in the room, trying to find a replacement pump sensor when it clicked. Boom, pop, zap. I saw a human explode, turn to plasma, then carbonize. The sound and smell never leave. I was sitting at a red light, when I saw a head-on collision between two other cars. One of the drivers went head first through the windshield, and landed with her head partially ripped off. Wear your seatbelts, kids. Wow. My dad went through a windshield before. He was on some drug, and crashed into a parked car. They had to sew his face back on. You can still see the scars, when he shaves his beard. I never drive without my seatbelt. Saw something similar in Botswana in 2017, but I didn't actually see it happen. In the middle of nowhere, we came across a car that had obviously flipped multiple times very shortly prior to our arrival. The driver and a passenger from the back were still in the car with seatbelts on, injured, but not life-threatening. They were both softly but frantically speaking in Setswana, which I don't speak. About 100 feet in front of the car, in the middle of the road, was the front seat passenger with only the bottom half of his head remaining. I was in a haze, for like a week, after seeing that. When I was just a kid, we witnessed a very bad motorcycle accident. The poor guy ran into the side of a car. He went flying over the top of the car. Before the guy hit the road, my father, who was a nurse, was out of the car. When the guy came down, we saw a huge gash in his thigh, and my dad quickly took off his tie, and used it as a tourniquet on the guy's upper thigh. Someone by then had thought quickly, and called an ambulance. No cell phones back then, so it took a while. Then the motorcycle rider went into cardiac arrest. My dad didn't waste any time and gave him CPR, until the paramedics arrived and took over. Thanks to my dad, the guy survived, and made a full recovery. Dad was being very modest about the whole thing, and didn't want any fuss, because it was his job. He is no longer with us, but I will always remember that event. He was a real-life hero. An entire second team, of like, 20 doctors, and nurses, and interns, and specialists, entered the room right before my wife gave birth, kind of freaked me out. The baby not crying, and being immediately whisked to the special baby table was pretty scary. Baby ended up okay, and just needed a tiny bit of fluid sucked out of their lungs, but I was definitely not prepared for it, to not be a fairly routine birth. My son was whisked away like that, I didn't even get to cut the cord. The only reason I didn't panic is, because the same thing happened when I was born, and I remember my mother talking about it. They took him, and he was stone gray, and after a few seconds he went pink. It was one of the wildest things I've ever seen. 1 second after my first child was born by C-section, one of the doctors dropped her straight on the floor. I have encountered some other bad things, but never anything that hit like that. She ended up totally fine, though, kept in neonatal intensive care unit, for a week, as a precaution. One of the doctors dropped her straight on the floor. Wow, I wouldn't even know how to react. But I guess, they are pretty slippery, when they first come out. My last baby and only son, flew out of me so fast, because not only was he my fourth, and I had done this before, but I was foregoing pain meds entirely, and I pushed a bit too hard to make it all end. The doc apparently caught him and fumbled a bit, because he came so quickly. Poor little guy had bruises up and down his forehead and temples for a few days. I once found myself crossing a very isolated walkway in my town at 1 a.m., no cars or any people in sight. While completely isolated, I met a group of 10 to 15 stray dogs, from varying sizes, coming from the opposite direction. I couldn't change my path or do anything about it. I needed to cross them. Some of them were quite big, but they were all kinda skinny, probably hungry, and one of the smaller ones started barking and threatening me. That encouraged all of them to start barking and doing the same. I knew, if one of them attacked me, if I ran or tried to fight back, it was game over. They were going to swarm and obliterate me. Death by being eviscerated by a dozen dogs. The thought alone made me shit myself completely. I ate the fear and just ignored them. They ended up not attacking, but that was a traumatic experience, just cause of the implication of what could possibly happen. Not fun. I had a similar situation. All the dogs on the island would pack up at night. They weren't huge dogs, but I had almost been killed by an Akita the previous year, so I was pretty skittish around dogs. The pack saw me and started walking towards me. I just stood there frozen in fear, trying not to move or make eye contact, but ready to run into the river. As it so happened, there was a white dog that hung out around our research station that everyone called White Man, that I would pet and give scraps to when I had them. Cool pooch. The pack encircles me, and I look down, and son of a bi White Man is the pack leader. So, I lean down, give him a little scratch, and wait for them to move on, but they don't. So, I carefully turn and start walking towards where I was staying, and the dogs walk with me. Probably about 10 to 15 dogs are ahead of me, and 10 behind. We're headed in the same direction, so we walk a bit, and I slow down trying to let them pass ahead of me, and I stop. The dogs ahead slow down and sniff off into the woods, and I turn around to try and get the dogs behind me ahead of me, and they jump back, like they wouldn't pass me. I had been incorporated into the pack with rank, LOL. I went from terrified to magical amazement in a heartbeat. They walked me home, and we'd stop, while a random dog would take off into the woods chasing something, or if someone had to stop and pee. When we got to the inn I was staying at, I just peeled off and they went on their way, and I went to bed. I tried to tell people the next day, but nobody believed me. My sister having a grand mal seizure. I was 5 years old, and had overheard my mom mentioning her epilepsy, without knowing what it was, but was effing terrified when she had that seizure while in our yard. Is she okay? In grade school a classmate had epilepsy, and I tell you, we always had her back. She had a seizure one time in a stairwell, while we were practicing for a recital. My friend Charlie calmly grabbed her, preventing a fall down the stairs, and we tended to her, while getting a grown-up. She's a lot better these days with the right meds. She was never able to get a driver's license, and is still sensitive to flashing lights. At that time, she collapsed in the yard, and started seizing pretty badly with her eyes in the back of her head. That's what scared me the most. Somehow, managed to get enough composure to run and tell my mom, who called EMS. I'm glad you were able to keep your classmate from worse injuries. I was driving through a rural area when my daughter says, "Mom, I think she needs help." I pulled over and turned around, and there was a maybe 12-year-old girl covered in blood on the side of the road. I don't know how I didn't see her, but another girl around the same age came out of the woods and said their car had flipped. I called 911 and went into the woods, and there's a car upside down in this 50-foot ravine. It was too steep to get down, but I could hear a woman screaming over and over again, "My baby, my baby." The girls said their mom and sister were still in the car, and rescuers arrived unbelievably fast. We gave the girls spare towels to stay warm, and then just got out of the way. I read in the paper that the 9-year-old sister had died. Now, I always scan those woods when I drive by. Probably 10 or 15 years ago, I saw a random light shining from a field while driving down I-40 late one night. I thought, that's a weird place for a light, but kept driving. A couple of days later, a farmer found the source of the light, a motorcycle that had left the road, and killed the rider. It still bugs me that I didn't stop. As a kid, seeing my 5-year-old friend going through leukemia did not make it. As a kid, nature protects you of sorrow, but it wasn't nice. Later in life you realize what you saw, and also understand quickly that people do not understand what it is until you see it yourself. Later in life, seeing health issues, somehow you are better prepared. 5-year-old and leukemia should never be able to be in the same sentence. My son is 8 years old, currently in hospital, with an infection due to him being immunocompromised, because leukemia, cancer. He's a warrior, over a year into treatment, and I know, looking at him, that if I had to do half of what this kid has done, I'd be on death's bed. First deployment to Iraq in 2006. Getting shot at for the first time, as a little 20-year-old version of Moist Stinky. I was not prepared. After a few seconds, I settled in. Next was a few days later on a convoy, encountered my first improvised explosive device. Shit gets very real, very fast, the first time you hear that crack. That first improvised explosive device explosion makes shit real in a hurry. Not that any of us thought it wasn't serious before that, but the first time, out of many, that something went boom, and you realize, that could have been my truck instead. ETA, Al-Anbar, 2007 to 2008. Was on a run, when I was 15-ish. Mom was at work and my sister was at school, so, I was totally alone, being that I did high school online at the time other than sports at the local high school. When I was a couple of blocks away, I got this really bad feeling like I was being followed, but it was like 10 a.m., so, I tried not to think too much about it. A really bad habit I had post-workout was that, given we were in a rural area, I'd walk around the house, without a shirt, while making my protein shake, and getting ready to soak in our hot tub. While doing these things, my dogs started barking wildly, but I dismissed it, as being some sort of animal in the woods. After about an hour, I went upstairs to change, and once again, heard my dogs barking at the fence line bordering the woods. When I looked out the window, I saw what looked like a man's shoulders, and the top of his head, facing our house directly in some bushes maybe 10 feet from the fence. After I stood there in horror for a little while, he turned around and disappeared into the woods. I immediately called my mom, who called the police, and they checked the woods behind our house, and didn't find anything. However, when Mom brought it up to some parents in the area, some said their sons also reported a creepy older dude following them in those woods and on the outskirts of the high school grounds. Needless to say, I switched to running on our treadmill for a long time, and made a habit of keeping all of our blinds closed. Was pretty terrified of this guy like breaking into the house and coming after me, too, so, for a long time, I kept my pocket knife on me at all times, and walked around the house with my gas-powered BB gun. Watched a group of people, cliff jumping nearby, where my family members and I were having a beach day. One of the guys landed wrong, and didn't come back up. Hearing and watching his friends or family looking for him was awful. Whenever we did cliff jumping as a kid, unsupervised of course, we wore life jackets. Now, we wore the life jackets because the foam would shoot you back up to the surface super fast, pop you up on the surface, and that was fun, not for safety reasons. I was 7 years old when I saw a motorcycle hit a station wagon. His face smashed through a window, and when the guy got up, his face was covered in blood, yelling that he couldn't see. My mom rushed me out of there as quickly as she could, but I still remember the look on his face till this day. I'm 47 now. I witnessed a hit and run when I was 7. Watched an 18-wheeler run a guy over. I learnt that day that skulls make a distinct noise when they crack. Mom screamed and covered my eyes, but the damage was already done, as I was on the front passenger seat. My dad, stoic as ever, only raised an eyebrow and notified the authorities. I opened the door of my childhood home to see a house covered floor to ceiling in black soot from the fire my mentally ill brother had set, and my father with his face down in a pool of blood, having met the business end of a shotgun. I didn't know my brother was dead already, but was somehow convinced, in that moment of horror, despite the unbreathable stale air that hit me upon opening the door, that he was inside, waiting to finish the job. I can never make fun of horror films again, because I could barely start my car as I dialed 911 and tried to get to safety. Christmas Eve, 2018. I'm pregnant, with an ileostomy bag, and have had a problem with my baby pushing on my intestine, causing it to protrude a couple of inches more than its usual half-inch, that sticks out from my body. It's just a bit though, never anything alarming. Until now. I feel an incredibly sharp pain in my lower abdomen, and start seeing white. I collapsed on the floor, unable to move. I feel an enormous amount of pressure coming from my stomach site, and it feels as if my bag is completely full. My husband carries me to the bathroom, and that's where we see it. My intestine has protruded, an entire 12 inches, from my body. 1 foot. It legitimately looks like Alien, or the Predator, or better yet, it's both Alien and Predator, and they're fighting one another. Blood is everywhere. Shit is spilling out. I have an entire intestine laying on the floor beside me. We have no way to contain it, or know what to do. We know that no hospital around us will be able to tackle this problem. We are in a very middle of nowhere town in South Georgia, so we make the difficult decision to drive to see my surgeon. That is 5 hours north of us. We make the trip, bloody, shit-covered intestine laying out in the car, screaming, crying, throwing up on the way, at 3 a.m., on Christmas morning. The ER doctor on call turned white as a Christmas ghost, and paged my doctor immediately. Long story short, I had the dead intestine chopped off, sewed the healthy intestine to my stomach, so it wouldn't happen again. Ended up having to take my gallbladder out, as well, had kidney stones 2 weeks later, and was on bed rest the rest of the pregnancy, until I had to deliver early, via C-section, to a beautiful, healthy baby boy, that's 5 now. Saw a guy get shot to death, in front of my old apartment building. Same. I'm in the UK. Didn't see anything, but I heard the gunshots and ducked. I was staying up late, watching telly Saturday night, my parents were in bed, and there was a loud party across the road. Curtains were pulled, so I didn't see it happen, but the sound of loud cracks made me get on the floor, quick time. Then you could hear a commotion of people scattering out of the party, and the music stopping, and cars driving away. My dad shouted downstairs, and called me up, to my parents' room. Saw the body hanging out of the window, and armed police SWAT teams arrived on the scene. I was a teenager when it happened. 1980s. I was swimming with my niece and nephew, in the wave pool. I half noticed 2 boys, 10, and 1 girl, 5, swim to the deep end. A few moments later, the waves started, and the boys quickly swam to the shallow end. Not really paying attention, I hear a tiny voice ask for help. Between huge waves, I see the little girl start climbing the ladder, and next wave knocks her into the water again. I looked at the lifeguards, and they were talking to each other, not watching the water. Another wave comes, and she's under the water. Keep in mind, I'm a good swimmer, and she is in the deep end, that is too overwhelming for me to swim in. So, I swim over to check on her, and grab her elbow, and lift her up. Then ask her if she is okay. She says, between gasping for air, that she has asthma. I ask if she wants to go back to the shallow end. Exhausted and out of breath, she just nods her head, yes. I pulled her back, to knee-deep water, and ask her to point out her parents. She does, and I ask if she is okay now. She says she is. Not so scary for me, but probably terrifying for her. When I was a Cub Scout, they had this local jamboree with all the packs and troops from the area. They put us all in the bleachers around a football field, and then had this helicopter fly in, to do a demonstration. The helicopter hovered over the field for a moment, and then dropped like a brick. I would guess the collective failed, and the blades went flat. Anyways, the thing hit the dirt hard, and tipped and the top and tail rotors hit the ground and disintegrated, and pieces went flying everywhere around the field and stands. No scouts were hurt, miraculously. But they made us all stay put in the bleachers, while they carefully extracted the pilot and co-pilot from the wreckage, and put them in ambulances. Walking through South Philly, 2 years ago, I walked under a highway overpass near the waterfront, on my way to a cafe. Shortly after crossing the street, I felt a massive shockwave on my back, with heat, and a sound like a cannon. As I turned, I saw a massive cloud of fire under the overpass, where I had just been seconds earlier. I was entranced by the way the fire in the air began to dissipate slowly into smoke, with no visible damage having been done to anything. There were no people in the affected area, and nothing flammable to catch. I called emergency services to report it. As I walked down the street, I spoke with some other folks, who came out to figure out what the hell happened. When I got to my destination, several blocks away, a cafe that I went to every day, for my lunch break, I was asked if I knew what the sound was. And finally, when I walked back to work, a school, my coworkers asked me what was going on, since I was the only staff not at the school, when they heard an explosion, and locked everyone down inside the building. Emergency services responded to multiple calls, but as there was no lasting damage, There wasn't anything for them to do. The best explanation I've heard was that there was an accident on I-95, spilling fuel through the rain vents to underneath the overpass. Some spark could have ignited it, creating the massive fireball I witnessed. Luckily, no harm was done to me or anyone else, but if I'd been a few seconds late in leaving for my lunch, I have no idea how differently things could have gone. This freak explosion that had everyone puzzled was heard through the city and couldn't be credibly traced back to a cause. Could have been the thing that killed me, and it wouldn't have been any less mysterious for it. All those folks who came out as the flames turned to smoke would be the ones to have found me, with even less of an idea what happened than I would have. I still think of what I saw, a cloud of fire, transforming to swirling tongues of flame, which dissipated into smoke before disappearing in the air. Freak hailstorm that came with a tornado warning. While getting ready in my windowless bathroom, when I heard the rain start pouring down, it just kept getting heavier and heavier, until I stopped what I was doing and looked outside. Middle of a summer day, and hail is literally coming out of the sky in buckets. The ground was covered by nickel-sized hail. I stared in awe for a moment, before I was like, oh, F. Tornado. Flew into an absolute panic. No way, my old-ass apartment building would survive one. Fortunately, it didn't spawn one, but I seriously thought I was F there for a minute. I came around a bend, on a highway, to see an overturned school bus on the shoulder, laying on its side, smoke coming from underneath, and the wheels still spinning. Somehow, I was the only car in sight, on a 3-lane freeway, at 7:30 to 8 a.m. As I slammed on my brakes, and pulled off the road, I see the driver climb out his window, now, on the top of the vehicle, and jump down and run up the embankment, as I'm jumping out of my car, and running toward the bus, calling 911 on my cellular, as I go. I have no idea what I'm going to see. I'm panicking. School buses don't even have seatbelts here. There could be dozens of children, in any state of injury, in there. I've already got PTSD from my own horrible car accident, so I'm freaking out. The bus is empty. When I was 15, my sister's boyfriend was living with us. One day, he beat the shit out of her, while I was the only one home. Thankfully, I share a yard with my grandparents, and when my grandfather heard the screaming, he ran to my house gun in hand, and got him away from her, and out of the house. The very next day, at like 6 a.m., on a Wednesday, my house was full raided for narcotics. They slammed my sister and mother on the ground, guns pointed, battering ram to the door and all. Turns out, her, at this point ex-boyfriend and her, had been selling drugs out of our house. So, within 24 hours, I witnessed my sister get the absolute hot dog water beat out of her, then woke up to screaming, and had a gun pointed to my head. Fun times. I'll tell you the scariest moment I've ever had. I was a young guy, who hadn't yet learned how important it is to drive defensively, and I was hurtling down a road on my motorcycle. Well, hurtling may be overstating it. I was only going about 50 miles per hour, but I hadn't yet learned that some people just have a blind spot when it comes to motorcycles. They can look straight at you and not see you. This is what the elderly driver departing a strip mall did, as he tried to cross my lane, turning left to go the opposite direction as mine. He had looked directly at me and not seen anything. I probably owe my life to his wife, seated next to him, who did see me, and yelled at him to stop. He did, but was now completely blocking the road in front of me. I had basically no time to think, but remember briefly thinking I had to put the bike down. But with the reflexes of a young guy, I swerved my bike hard left to try and cross the car's front bumper. I instinctively looked down at my right foot pedal to see it clear the bumper by less than the width of my foot. At 50 miles per hour or so. Now I was in wrong-way traffic, so, at the next median, I went back on the right side. About a mile or so later, I had to stop at another strip mall, lay down on the pavement and start shaking uncontrollably for a pretty good while. After I recovered, I drove back to my place, thought for a day or two about it, and put the bike up for sale. I saw a B-2 stealth bomber fly over an air show I was at. They said it was on its way home from Afghanistan. It was nearly silent, and looked like a UFO on the horizon. As it got closer, it opened one of its bomb bays, and you could see inside it, as it flew overhead. It was empty. I had a moment of realization that it carries nuclear weapons in those bays sometimes. That was weird and scary. Was moving to another state. Driving cross-country. I was in the car with my mom. My older sister and her friend were in the car behind us. I woke up to my mom gasping. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I turned around in my seat and saw my sister's car flipping through the air. It was like slow motion. When the vehicle came to a stop, my mom ran over to my sister's friend, who was ejected from the vehicle, and took care of her. I walked around looking for my cats that were in the car. I was only 9, so my mom screamed at me not to go to the car my sister was in, and not to go by where her friend was laying. As I was looking for my cats and processing, I saw my sister limping over. Her left foot was covered in blood and glass, and her just crying and asking where her friend was. Her car rolled 7.5 times. It was unrecognizable as a vehicle. Somehow, both my sister and her friend made it out alive. But I'll never forget seeing my sister limping through the carnage, like the survivor of an ancient battle, or witnessing her car flipping through the air as chunks of debris flew off.